Hello, you're watching World Talks on TVP World. My name is Sasha Farbach. A landmark vote in Turkey on Monday has created a legal framework for the Kurdistan Workers Party, also known as the PKK's disarmament, after more than 4 decades of conflict, just as Ankara seeks a larger diplomatic and security role across its neighborhood. Turkey's chief diplomat, Hakan Fidan, is in Egypt Thursday, where defense cooperation and crises stretching from Gaza and Syria to Iran and the Strait of Hormuz are on the agenda. Joining us now to discuss it all is Adam Michalski, Senior Fellow in the Department for Turkey, Caucasus and Central Asia at the Center for Eastern Studies. Good to have you with us.
Pleasure to be here.
So this landmark new beginning here, if we can call it that, many have died over these 4 decades, this conflict between the PKK and the Turkish authorities, 40,000, something like this. So maybe just a little bit of why this timing now, and what does this enable strategically Erdoğan to do now?
So I'd break it down perhaps to 2 aspects which might give us some clues when it comes to the timing of this. Internally, I'd say that this law comes at a moment where Erdoğan is himself preparing for early elections. Now, early elections in Turkey are a very specific mechanism on their own, because they allow President Erdoğan to essentially run once again for president, even though he's already been president for 2 terms, and constitutionally you can only be a president for 2 terms. However, if you do early elections, you can do it 3 terms. The problem, however, is that Erdoğan's coalition does not have a majority in the parliament in order to kickstart these 2 early elections. So one of the things that we've been seeing in Turkey is Erdoğan has been looking for additional MPs who could back this vote. And of course, one of the groups which has been mentioned was the Kurdish DEM Party, which controls a small percentage of seats, but enough in order to kickstart that early election. So this whole amnesty law, it comes at a time when Erdoğan is also trying to make, some type of a positive move towards the Kurdish party, towards the Kurdish people, by showing to them that, he's willing to cooperate on the PKK issue to try to find a solution which will be acceptable for the Turkish state, but that would definitely also move forward the PKK process, peace process, which we have been seeing going on for the last 2 years approximately. So I think that this is the internal aspect of this whole kind of debate right now happening in Turkey, that of course we have this whole internal aspect to the PKK amnesty law. But obviously, internationally, when we're looking at the whole situation, we have to take into consideration that, of course, Turkey in this very volatile region, it prefers and wants to, of course, close some of its ongoing conflicts, because there's, of course, additional and bigger threats taking place or being present in the Middle East. And so, trying to resolve the PKK issue is definitely one of these aspects. And also, it's important to mention that the PKK, when it comes to its international presence in Syria, in Iraq, it has over the years essentially been decimated. So for Ankara, it is a good moment to show to the PKK that any type of military option when it comes to negotiating is no longer on the table. So you might as well accept the fact that the only way how you can get more rights or achieve anything when it comes to Kurdish rights in Turkey is to try to move it in a political way, of course in a way that is dictated by Ankara's terms, not on the Kurdish terms. But I think that this is definitely also one of the elements to use the weakness of the PKK to essentially try to close the decades-long conflict.
Yeah, and also you mentioned the international component. I mean, Kurds are in various parts of that region, not just in southern Turkey there, but also, as you mentioned, in Syria and other parts of different countries. Now, one of these amnesty, let's say, if this goes ahead, which seems to have that support from the Turkish state, is also predicated on the fact that there will be this disarmament. And I think the Turkish authorities have to say, okay, when we agree that that's happening. So there's been so much distrust in that. How many challenges are ahead for that? Or is this going to ultimately derail this? Because, I mean, that seems like a very complicated verification process.
Yes, and so I think that with a whole amnesty law, we have to keep in mind that there is this one kind of condition that before this return of PKK soldiers can happen, before people can be granted partial amnesty, at least those people who are eligible as seen by the law that has been passed. First, the Turkish National Security Council needs to make the decision whether PKK has disarmed itself. And the problem is that, of course, so far, it hasn't made that decision, even though the PKK has said that it has disarmed itself. So we're stuck in this kind of political limbo at this stage, where we have this law which, you know, opens up the gates, but it is, but we still haven't had a decision from Ankara itself with regards to the status of that organization itself. And so this is something that might, well, maybe not derail, but it might definitely postpone and delay any type of implementation of this law. And we don't know how long, of course, it's going to take before the Turkish Security Council declares that the PKK is no longer an active institution, that it has fully ceased to exist. And this is, I think, something that could be carrying on for quite a long time. And as I've said, you know, it's less about the disarmament and moving on the PKK process, as I said at the beginning, as it is more sometimes about political calculations. So I'd look at this amnesty law as a kind of gesture, but something that doesn't really change necessarily the political landscape when it comes to the Kurdish-Turkish peace process as of right now. But that does not change that we do, however, have a law. And we have a, you know, specific movement in a direction which definitely opens up a pathway of how this peace process could resolve some of its most crucial aspects in the future. But as you've mentioned, and as I have mentioned right now, this is still very much an ongoing process that could very easily get bogged down by political issues, especially, you know, if you would have some type of a PKK uprising somewhere. This would definitely hurt this process itself.
All right, so still much ahead and seeing how that's going to develop, but also looking at how much Erdoğan is trying to very much consolidate what he's doing domestically. Let's step out for a minute internationally again. We also have Turkey's chief diplomat, Fidan, who's in Egypt on Thursday. I think it's a two-day visit. Now, this comes across an interesting time because about a week ago or so, or not even a week yet, we had that new pact, that security pact, right, signed in Mecca. That was Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Pakistan. Now, Erdoğan himself has said he'd like Egypt to join that as well. So give us your take there of what that visit means, and if we're going to have another member to this new defense alliance.
So the defense alliance that was signed in Mecca was something that Ankara has been trying to achieve for, well, ever since I think Israel begun its full-scale war against Hamas and other institutions and Palestine. And Turkey wants to basically build a regional security complex, a defense union, in part because it does not see organizations like NATO necessarily fulfilling its agenda in this region, in fact being pretty much not present over there. So Turkey wants to have some type of a regional military order that would allow it to show to countries like Israel and of course to some extent Iran that they are capable of organizing a bloc of countries which is capable of cooperating even though they do have political differences when it comes to, you know, some aspects of the region, but are still capable of overcoming them and, you know, signing a joint declaration in which, you know, we have a very clear statement on all sides that an attack on essentially one is an attack on all, echoing the same Article 5 when it comes to NATO. And this is something that Turkey wants to send a clear signal to Israel, particularly that they're not alone in the Middle East, that they have countries which are also on the same page. Of course, it has to be remembered that Turkey wants to strengthen this alliance by having as many members within the region join it, because this kind of gives it more significance. It gives it, of course, more countries which have a stake when it comes to their own defense, collective defense. But at the same time, you know, this is also becoming this kind of a framework for, to some extent, competition competition because, perhaps Saudi Arabia has their own partners. Turkey would definitely want to see Egypt, but I can also assure you that, they would want to see Azerbaijan join this coalition. Every country is going to have, I think, their own priorities with regards to whether they want to make the alliance bigger. If so, which members should they take, in part because it also serves their own interests. And as I've said, every country has a slightly different agenda. For the Saudis, the much bigger threat is Iran. For Turkey, the much bigger threat is Israel. Whereas for Pakistan, which is really on the outskirts of the Middle East, well, it's a platform for cooperation and also strengthening its position against India. So, we can see how large this coalition already with its 3 members is when it comes to these priorities. So I think that every country is going to right now try to maximize this institution, this pact, and try to make as much use of it. But we also have to keep in mind that while it's a big development, we have to take into consideration that the Middle East has historically been divided when it comes to interests. So we'll still see how the development of this defense pact goes on in the future when it comes to its real ability to actually deliver some form of a new regional defense union.
All right, Adam, we're pressed on time, but just one sentence, if I could. In terms of NATO commitments that Turkey has, Article 8 precludes allies from making more military alliances. Does this weaken NATO by Turkey pushing in these other alliances?
I wouldn't necessarily look at it from that way. I think for Ankara, it's more about diversifying its security connections rather than necessarily trying to duplicate alliances. So no, but you also have to take into consideration that, the United States, as much as it is engaged in the Middle East, they also want to, have the Middle East kind of take care of its own security concerns so that the United States can pivot towards China and other countries. So I think that this development essentially opens up the gate for the Middle East to start organizing its own security. So I think that from even the United States point of view, it's not something that breaks up the unity of NATO.
All right, so interesting one still to observe. Well, look, thanks for all that. Really appreciate your insights there. Adam Michalski, thank you so much.
Thank you.
And thank you for watching World Talks, but stay right here for more news and commentary throughout the day on TVP World. Goodbye.